Chapter 9. The road to Triathale had become crowded with travelers from all over the central region of Tulath. There were elves from as far north as the Leviathan Lakes and as south as the Flatlands. Most were on horseback, except for those whose villages were just a few miles away. The sun coming through the canopy above did nothing to warm the solemn procession that traveled largely in silence. Elves, seeing neighbors they recognized from past dealings, merely nodded to each other in greeting. As they moved out into full sunlight, the melancholy gave way to dismay when the devastation of the forest was made apparent. It now ended much further back than before. Axe-hewed stumps were all that was left of once mighty sentinels that had guarded the edge of these woods for ages, chopped down in just a few days' time at the whim of the would-be king. Eltherea had sensed it before Sunset had walked out into the scene, but still gasped upon the sight. "Curse him," she thought. "How has he wreaked so much destruction in so short a time?" She felt the knife against her thigh, taking some comfort as she imagined herself driving it through his chest. Up ahead lay the fortress. The temporary huts that had been within the courtyard now sat scattered around the exterior of the wall, having been moved to make room for the hundreds of elves attending the ceremony. Drawing nearer, Eltherea could see what some of the timber had been used for. The portcullis had been rebuilt, and was now raised above the gateway. The spikes at the bottom of the latticework gate hung above the entrance like the teeth of some large predator, poised to snap on those passing underneath. Before it, elves dismounted their horses, which were led to a fenced-off paddock nearby. Guards at the gate collected anything that resembled a weapon, stashing bows, arrows, and knives in a nearby structure. On the gatehouse wall above stood archers, and she was sure there were more hiding behind the arrow slits below them. "Milady, I am here to escort you to your tent, where you will be attended to and await your entrance for the ceremony." Eltherea looked down to see a young elf looking up at her nervously. She looked over at her family and Clarion and Richard, telling them to go on, she would be fine, and despite their hesitancy, they did so. She then indicated to Sunset to follow the child as he led them to a tent dyed with vibrant blue and green stripes. Above it flew a flag depicting the 7-pointed crown she had seen on his letter. She dismounted Sunset by the side, where there was straw and water waiting for the horse. After removing her dress from the saddlebag, she entered the torchlit tent to find 2 elves standing in silence. One was a guard who stepped out to stand at the entrance. The other, dressed in what Eltherea now understood to be servant garb, looked to be not much older than the child who led her here. "Milady," she said, "I'm here to help you dress and arrange your hair." "Please, call me Eltherea, and I can dress myself, thank you. I have been doing it by myself for ages, and don't intend to stop now. As for my hair, my sister worked on it earlier, so there is no need for further embellishment. However, if I might have something to drink and eat, I would be thankful. It has been a long ride, and I fear this is my only respite before further events." Yes, Eltherea. The king has also requested you wear this today," and she gestured to a tiara sitting on a small table. Eltherea picked it up and examined the gold metalwork and inlaid emeralds. She set it back down and said, "Of course, we shouldn't disappoint our king, should we?" If the young elf noticed the sarcasm, she didn't show it, but simply bowed and left. Thankful that her ruse had worked, Eltherea went to close the flap on the tent when the guard stepped in. "You dismissed your servant?" As I told her, I am in more need of food and water than I am a dresser. "Then I must observe you undress, to ensure you carry nothing that could disrupt the ceremony. Apologies, milady. It is King Ranith's orders." Eltherea sighed. "So be it. At least lower the flap so others may not look in." The guard turned to do so and found a knife pressed against his throat. "Open your mouth," she commanded. He did so, and with her other hand she poured in the sleeping draught from the vial. She then pushed his jaw closed. He swallowed and collapsed to the ground. "Now that only leaves one way to deal with Ranith," she said, tossing down the empty bottle. "Sorry for the disturbance, Eritha," she said, reaching back to the nape of her neck. A mouse came out from under her hair and climbed into her hand. "Everything in order?" she asked. Eritha stood up on her hind legs, showing the tiny scabbard secured around her tiny waist by a tiny belt, the poison-tipped needle still within it. Eltherea set the mouse down on the table next to the tiara and dragged the guard's body to the far end of the tent, doing her best to cover it with the rug covering the ground of the tent. She then got dressed, placed the tiara on her head, and returned Eritha to her hiding spot beneath her hair. No sooner had she done so than a voice was at the entrance. "Eltherea, I have brought you something to drink. I would have brought food, but was told that it is time for the ceremony to begin." She let the young elf in and thanked her for the water. If the servant had any question as to the whereabouts of the guard, she didn't ask. Eltherea emptied the glass in one go, set it on the table, and wiped her mouth. She took a cursory look in the mirror placed nearby and said simply, "Right." She then stepped out into the bright midday sun. Richard had never felt so out of place. "It's like I stepped into a United Colors of Benetton model convention," he thought. Everyone there was a head taller and possessing an angelic beauty emanating from features of all shades and types known to the human race. Except these aren't humans, he reminded himself. Despite feeling like the proverbial sore thumb, he was being greeted with warmth and recognition. Apparently word had spread beyond Sheness of his defense of one of their own, resulting in a kind of acceptance and esteem that had eluded him in his own world. Walking among these fairy tale characters within the walls were wolves and even a bear, though he understood these were Raneth's elves inhabiting the animals' bodies. If they had a role beyond intimidation and threat, he did not know. However, the purpose of the birds that circled overhead was obvious as they spied down upon the throng, watching for anything untoward. Beyond these sights, Richard marveled at the fortress, which looked to him like something from the Middle Ages. Banners of blue and green trimmed with gold hung from the battlements, which he guessed had been put up for this occasion. More decorations adorned a platform built high enough from the ground so that even he could see it over the heads of the elves. It sat situated before the main entrance of the keep, and in its center was what looked to be an ornate throne, its back facing the crowd. "That is where the ceremony will be held," Bellarania said. "We should make our way there." He followed Bellarania, Malongar, Luthnoel, and Calarian as they made their way through the crowd to the platform. Soon after reaching it, the sound of a horn being blown came from behind, and they turned to see the portcullis, that had closed after everyone had arrived, was now being lifted. Though not visible yet, Richard understood that Eltherea had just entered the courtyard. Eltherea sat atop Sunset with both legs to one side, which she found a ridiculous and awkward way to ride. No one mounted a horse in this manner on purpose, because no elf would wear a long dress when on horseback. But she knew practicality was not a concern to Raneth. This was just another part of the spectacle he desired. Thankfully, she had been aware of the method of her entrance from the letter, and had practiced with Sunset back in Sheness. The two managed a level of dignity as they entered through the gateway. After the horn sounded and the gate raised, they followed behind two guards carrying pikes, from which were attached banners bearing Raneth's crest. They bellowed, Make way for the future Queen of Tulath," as they marched, and the crowd parted before them to clear a path. She felt her face grow hot with embarrassment and guilt as all those faces looked up at her as she passed. "I must not concern myself with their estimates of me," she thought. "After tonight, all will know where my heart truly lies, when his heart is skewered on my blade." When Eltherea reached the platform, she saw her father, mother, sister, Calarian, and Richard standing at the front, near the guards who stood looking back at the crowd. She tried to smile, but the effort to do so was betrayed in her expression. They looked back at her in kind, except for Richard, whose face bore the wide eyes and open mouth of someone in a trance. She turned her attention to the platform that, save for the adorning banners and a throne facing the wrong way, was empty. "Where is Raneth? Where is Paul?" The letter had not detailed what would happen after she entered into the courtyard. The 2 guards that had led her joined the others standing watch, and she was left by an attached stair landing where she dismounted Sunset, who was brought back to the gate by one of the servants. As she stood considering whether she should ascend the steps before her, the sound of several horns blared out, coming from the battlements of the keep. As they continued to blow in echoing rounds, the throne began to turn. At first Eltherea thought magic was involved, but then realized that the throne sat upon a circular cutout, and underneath the stage a hidden servant rotated it. Raneth came into view then, sitting atop the ornately carved golden throne, a crown upon his head. She rolled her eyes at the pompous theatrics, but when it stopped turning and he stood holding his hand out to her, she walked up the steps. "Where is Paul? I will not go through with this unless I know he is safe," she hissed at him when she was within his earshot. "No hello, my sweet, thank you for arranging this beautiful and grand event?" he sighed, then raised his hand to the guard at the keep doors, who proceeded to open them. From out of the darkness stepped a guard holding 2 poles, one on each shoulder, and as he came out further, she could see they were attached to the top of something made of iron bars. A second guard followed, holding up the other side. They came up steps at the back of the platform, setting down what she now saw was a cage on the other side of the throne. Inside was Paul, sitting upon his knees, as that was all the height for which his enclosure allowed. She ran over to him, causing the guards to draw their swords and direct them not at her, but in between the bars towards Paul. He looked up at her, sadness in his eyes, and she saw that his mouth was hidden behind a metal piece fastened tightly against the bottom of his face and jaw, sitting just below his nostrils. His hands were manacled, and he looked pale, but she noted that he appeared clean and was dressed in fine clothes, which made it seem all the more cruel and absurd. Unable to reach out to him, she angrily walked back to Raneth. "You bastard, Raneth! You are treating him like a rabid animal. Why have you muzzled him?" she asked him, as the shocked murmurs of the crowd died down. "I didn't want him interrupting the ritual, that is all. Once it is finished, he will be freed from all restraints. Now, may we get on with this?" "Tell your men to withdraw their weapons and step away, then we may." Raneth motioned at them, and they sheathed their swords, then moved to the corner of the platform. "Now for the officiant," he said, turning back to the keep, where emerged another figure from the doors. "Officiant? Another antiquated thing from the days of kings," she thought. Understandable, though. The elves of today speak their words of love and commitment to each other during the ceremony, with no need for another. But he knows I have nothing to say to him in that regard. The elf who came up the steps to stand by them wore a simple blue robe, his face shadowed by a hood. He withdrew it, revealing shortly cropped gray hair above the severe face of one who has never found anything amusing in a lifetime. He reached into one of his sleeves and retrieved a small leather pouch, which he opened, pouring the content into Raneth's hand. It was an emerald, polished smooth and round. Eltherea realized this was a substitute for the seed normally held by the participants during a marriage ceremony, who would plant it at their home later as a sign of their growing relationship. If this gemstone was an ancient kingly version or something dreamt up by Raneth, she did not know. Regardless, she knew what was expected, so she faced him, putting her left hand over his, covering the stone. She kept her gaze down at her feet, though, her one act of defiance in this moment. The officiant pulled a parchment from his other sleeve, unrolled it, and began reading in a voice meant more for the crowd than for the 2 standing before him. Eltherea caught little of it, something about how power and might will be forged through this union, and blessings shall rain down, or some such. Well, the old elf bleated on, and her attention drifted with the strangeness of it all. She caught the sound of metal tapping and scraping against metal. It was Paul's manacles on the bars of his cage. She had heard the rattling of his chains earlier, which she imagined was Paul anxiously moving in that small space. She hadn't dared look back at him then. She just couldn't. This was not that, though. This was methodical. There were patterns. The tapping stopped for a few moments. Then it began again. Raneth ignored the noise coming from Paul's cage. He was more irritated that his soon-to-be wife would not look at him. Consternation became puzzlement as he watched her brow furrow and her eyes dart about as if she was working out a difficult riddle. Then she finally raised her eyes to his. In her stare, he saw more than the usual contempt. There was a ferocity in it that startled him. But her expression softened and a smile rose to her lips. He thought that strange, but thought it stranger still when she put a hand on the side of his face. Then he thought nothing else, as his mind went dark. Time seemed to stop as guards and villagers alike wrestled with what they had just witnessed. To all it appeared that Eltherea had put her hand on Raneth's face, and he had fallen lifelessly to the floor. As awareness spread, loud babbling came from the crowd. The officiant's booming voice having been silenced, he stood looking from Raneth's body to Eltherea, unsure of what he should do. "Eltherea, behind you!" It was her father's voice coming from the edge of the stage. She turned to see one of the guards that had carried Paul's cage was rushing at her with his sword raised, ready to strike. She backed away quickly, preparing to fight, when he let out a howl, his sword dropping to the floor and his body following quickly behind. Eltherea watched Eretha, the mouse, run from the body, her needle left behind in the guard's ankle. The other guard also spotted her and, figuring it had something to do with his fellow guard now writhing around in agony, began trying to stomp on the little creature. "Stop!" came Bellarania's voice as she jumped up on the platform, brandishing a pike that she had taken from a guard on the ground moments before. She charged at Eretha's attacker, the point towards his chest. He tried hitting it away with his sword as he backed away, but misjudged the distance to the edge of the platform and found himself falling backwards to the ground. With no pause to recognize her victory, she went to the mouse and put her hand out. Eretha climbed on, and Bellarania placed her on her shoulder. She stood, looked at her sister, then out at the crowd, holding her weapon at the ready should more guards come. Eltherea surveyed the scene before her. She saw her mother and father on the ground below the platform, each of them holding a weapon they had removed from a defeated guard. Calarian had just grabbed a guard who was trying to climb the stairs, but was now being squeezed in their mighty arms. Even Richard had joined the fight, along with other villagers who realized they outnumbered Raneth's elves. While it appeared no blood had been spilled yet, she knew there were still wolves and a bear amongst the crowd that will not be so easily defeated. Archers will also be readying themselves in the keep and outer wall. She had to do something. "Elves of Triathale, stop fighting!" she shouted as loudly as her lungs would allow. "Your king merely sleeps." She ran over to Raneth's body, lifting his upper half up as she sat behind him, placing a hand to his head. Raneth's eyes opened and he looked about, confusion across his face. "What? What is happening? Guards, come to—" His words ended there as Eltherea enthralled him back to sleep. She stood back up, letting Raneth's head hit the floor of the platform. She now had the attention of all those who were near enough to have witnessed the display. "You see? I have enthralled him. Yet we know that elves cannot be enthralled, but humans can be. I have done the magic on Paul, so I tell you it works on them. My friends, we have all been deceived." She paused to draw a large breath before driving the point home. "For that is not Raneth. That is Levi dwelling in his body." A clamor spread throughout the crowd. Guards looked to one another, then to her, doubt on their faces. "If you do not believe your own eyes, then let us hear from Paul. You can see he was silent so that he would not reveal Levi's secret. Still he managed to convey it to me. Release him and let him speak unless you fear the truth." There was a long pause. Then the elf that had been pierced by Eretha's needle, whose pain had subsided yet his body had remained prone on the stage, raised an arm. In his hand was the key to the cage. Eltherea took it, opened the lock, and helped Paul stand. She fought the urge to embrace him, instead removing his gag, exposing a scruffy, pale face. She asked him if he was strong enough to talk to everyone, Since she spoke in Elvish, however, he couldn't understand. "Ellie," he said raspily through dry, cracked lips, "they took my Elvish tongue away. What is happening?" "Paul, do you know how Levi came to dwell in Raneth?" "Yeah, that arrogant prick told me everything." "Can you tell them? If I gave you back your Elvish, would you help them see the truth?" "I'll try. I could use some water first." Eltherea got a flask from someone in the crowd, and after Paul downed the entirety of it, she gifted him her language again. Then, as she propped him up with an arm around his waist, he did his best to recount the story that Levi had told him, about how he had tricked Raneth into switching bodies and then murdered him. The words rang true to the elves, and made sense of Raneth's change after Levi's disappearance. Confronted with this reality, the disillusioned guards laid down their weapons. Discovering that they had been following a human who was inside the skin of their fellow elf whom he had slain seemed to have awakened them from a dream. Dazed, they ambled about, many of them making their way to those elves of their former villages. Eltherea and Paul sat on the platform, their legs hanging over the edge. They watched Bellarania and other healers help those guards and villagers who had been hurt in the skirmish. Paul saw former servants and guards tearfully embrace their recently shunned families. "So what happens now?" he asked her. "To them, they will return to their villages. There will be no punishment, but, well, there's no word in Elvish for it. I think something like deprogramming might be needed. I don't know how strongly they believed Levi's ideology, but the fact they even considered the things he espoused is troubling. My hope is that they will see how unnatural and wrong such thinking is." After a moment, she said, "Maybe since that evil has found its way here, I need to share some stories from other places, so elves see how corrosive it has been to your world. Your history is something I'm not keen to revisit, though." "What about him?" Paul said, looking back at Levi and Raneth's body, still lying unconscious where Eltherea had enthralled him earlier. "Oh, there will be a lot of discussion regarding that. He can't be sent back to other place, not in that body, and no one will allow him in any village in Tulath, of that I'm sure. Personally, I think he should have this fortress all to himself. He can be the king of Triathale if he wants, and rot alone in this prison of his own making." She felt the knife still tied to her thigh. "You don't know this, but I planned on killing him tonight. I didn't see another way to end this. Then you sent me that message with Morse code. That was genius, Paul. He is Levi. It was all I needed to know." "I'm just glad you understood it. That you did, then realized you could enthrall him was more than I could have hoped for." He sat there quietly for a moment, pondering if he should even ask, but forged ahead. "And what about us?" Eltherea looked out at the courtyard filled with villagers and Raneth's elves reuniting, and her eyes welled with tears. "I knew I had lost Raneth to Levi's corruption soon after he arrived. Then I learned from you that he was truly gone, killed by that monster not long after that. I'll need some time to process everything, to grieve even. I hope you understand." She looked at him then, taking his hand in hers. "I also hope you'll come back to stay in Chinese, though." "There's nowhere else I'd rather be," he answered, adding, "Also, I don't have anywhere else to go." The truth of that suddenly sank in like a stone dropped into a lake. It rippled outward as thoughts of his hometown, his family, Minneapolis, the U of M, and the entirety of his former life and world arose in his mind. The sudden awareness of all that had changed and all that he had lost was threatening to overwhelm him. Then he felt the warmth of her hand in his, and his mind calmed. "Worth it," he thought.